Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's session. I hope you're all ready. I can see some people that came in early and joined us early. You're all welcome. Today promises to be amazing, and today is our last day for the year. So sit tight, and we can't wait to meet our winner for the day. So let's sit tight and enjoy our Christmas presentation at Christmas study time. I'm very impressed that so we took out the time to be able to make it for this session despite the holiday seasons in the air. So we're going to make it fun and engaging and also very interesting. So sit tight and learn. Thank you, Oluwasegun, for coming early, and Abdulatif and Tayo and did so. We're glad to have you here. So, hello, David. Are we ready?
Hello, hi. Can you hear me?
Yes. I think
Okay.
we've been waiting for you, and everyone is ready to welcome
So
and
I was
receive their
trying to,
music.
yeah, I was trying to adjust like my headset because it's coming out and I'm getting the feedback. So I was trying to sort. Oh, okay, it's doing something now. Oh, I think I switched it off again. Sorry about that. So let's see that again, and let's see if that's gonna fix itself now. And let's see if that fixes itself. Seems to be good now. Let me try that again. Oh, by the way, so how's your day been? Blessing, while I'm trying to fix this. Has it been a good
Oh,
day?
it's been amazing. It's been amazing. The whole week has been like a whole lot of rush. At my place of work, we had our end of the year party and it was crazy fun. But then we're rounding up the year, trying to have a reflection of the year. And I think that's what we're also doing here. We're going to have today have a reflection of what we're, as we learn, we also try to have a reflection of what we've had throughout the year, and then try to make plans for next year, hoping to come back better and great. So,
Yeah. Yeah,
how's
same.
it
Same.
been for everybody? So, if you're here, if you can hear me, can you drop a message to tell us how your year has been, how it has been as whatever it is, in
Yeah.
any area, even if it's not only for studies. Okay, David.
Yeah, and it's even interesting because we have HM here again today. So HM was a winner yesterday. So HM we're working together with AWS to get your exam voucher to you, but that will get to you. Um, so let's see, we have a few other people like on the line. So we have Abdurrahman, we have Adeyemi, we have Ditso, we have Mr. Tayo himself, we've got Tosin, we've got Abdul Latif, Oluwasegun. So we've got quite a lot of people online, actually. So it's very interesting. Okay. So I think that I should be ready to get started. So let's see. Let me know when you can see my screen.
If we can see his screen, please drop a message. Say, put a thumbs up or just say okay. I can see his screen. Yes, he's back today.
Awesome. So yeah, so I can see that people can see my screen. Okay, so let's get started. So today's session, so as Blessing mentioned, so thanks for the introduction, Blessing. So today we're going to be focusing on the serverless security, and this will be the last study series for this year before we all go enjoy the holidays, and then we'll come back next year to pick up our study series again. And of course, we'll have amazing prizes for all the sessions that we're going to be going through. So there will be a quiz at the end of today, and I believe that the prize for today is a $50 AWS credit voucher. So that is the price for today. So so stay tuned. We'll have a quiz, and you could be the winner of the $50 AWS credit voucher for today. Okay, so let's get started. So what we're going to be looking at today is going to be looking at serverless security. I'm going to be looking at it from three main aspects. We're going to be looking at authentication for serverless architecture in AWS. So leveraging services like Amazon Cognito for authentication. We'll be looking at just controlling access to serverless, APIs on AWS, leveraging services like the Amazon API Gateway. Then we'll be looking at just securing AWS Lambda functions, so looking at the service itself and some of the capabilities that we can put in place to secure our Lambda function. So that are the three main things that we're going to be looking at today, and we'll try to keep in time so we can get to the quiz and we can get our winner for today's prize. So I just like this image. It's a very interesting one. So behind this,
Very interesting.
yeah, it is a very interesting one because we got this serverless services. We're running this code in response to different events, but under the mask, we actually still have servers. So we have servers, but only that the servers are no longer managed by us. The servers are managed by AWS themselves. So they manage the servers for us while we'll focus on our code, our data, our APIs. So here is a typical serverless architecture in AWS. So this is a typical serverless architecture in AWS where you have a web application that's hosted on S3. And yes, we can have web applications hosted on AWS S3 buckets. So in this architecture, all the services that are implemented as part of this architecture are serverless. And what that means is that there are no EC2 instances for us to manage. There are no servers for us to manage. So for example, in this instance, we have, again, the web application, which is hosted on Amazon S3. But then we're essentially leveraging CloudFront here as of like an entry point. So CloudFront is going to be used to serve the web content that's hosted on S3. And then we have our APIs, which is sort of like the application layer. So something that you typically find in a three-tier web application architecture like in the past. We have our APIs hosted on Lambda in this case. So, and the APIs are exposed, not directly to the internet or not directly publicly. They are exposed through a service called the Amazon API Gateway, which we're going to introduce today. And in this case, we have application data. Maybe that's a semi-structured data set stored on Amazon DynamoDB, which is a serverless database solution in AWS. Now, for this entire setup, if we need to implement authentication, we can leverage capabilities built into Amazon Cognito for authentication and access. And in this case, for geographical entry point into our application, we can leverage Route 53. So this is a typical serverless architecture in AWS. But how do we secure a typical serverless architecture like this? So let's get into it by starting with the number one thing that we need to put in place. And I just hear the sound now. Let me just check to make sure that we're all still good. Okay, I think that we're all still good. I think maybe there's just some disconnections that happened. Okay, so, and remember that as we go through this, if you have any questions, feel free to put your questions in the chat window, and Blessing will make me aware and read them out to me. So let's start with the first aspect of security here, which is authentication, and leveraging Amazon Cognito for that. So Amazon Cognito, so it's a web identity provider by AWS. So let's get into that first of all. So as mentioned earlier, this service is a web identity provider, right? And what that simply means is it is a service that we can use to authenticate users and authenticate identities over the web, right? So some of us may be familiar with Kerberos authentication protocol years ago. That's definitely not a protocol that you want to expose out on the web, right? You don't want to expose Kerberos on the internet. There's too many ports. There's too many TCP ports for you to open for us to expose that. But what services like Cognito does is they offer modern authentication protocols like OpenID Connect and OAuth for authorization, and all those modern authentication protocols, they work over the web, over HTTP, over HTTPS. So authentication over the web is what this is about. So some information about just Amazon Cognito very quickly. Number one, it can provide access and authentication for web and mobile applications. It's a managed service. AWS manages the service under the hood for us. So we don't have to manage. AWS manages that for us. But as part of the management, it has encryption built in at rest and in transit. So one of the good things about Amazon Cognito is that we can authenticate with users that we've created in Cognito itself, but we can also authenticate with social identity providers. So if you want users to be able to authenticate to your application using their Facebook identities, using their Google identities, using their Amazon identities, you can integrate all those identity providers, which are IDPs. You can integrate them into Cognito and leverage that to authenticate to your application. It has built-in MFA support, so we don't have to go implement a third-party MFA capability for users that are authenticating using Cognito. And apart from integration with social identity providers, it also offers integration with enterprise identity providers. So leveraging things like SAML identity providers. So when we talk about Cognito, there are two main aspects of Cognito that you need to know if you're planning to do the security exam. We have user pools, which we'll look at in a minute, and we have identity pools. And if you're planning to do the exam, you need to know these two very well, and you need to know the differences between them. So let's start first with user pools. So user pools, that is where our user information is stored. That's why it's called user pools. So users that we're creating, users that need to be able to authenticate to our application, this is the directory where that information will be stored. It will be stored in user pools in Cognito. But of course, as I mentioned earlier, we can also integrate user pools with external identity providers like maybe SAML providers, or let's say OpenID Connect identity providers. Let me see if I can authenticate very quickly to my AWS environment, not to show you a full detail of this because we have limited time, but just to give you a quick overview of what that looks like. So let me go to my AWS Management Console, which I've already authenticated to. So if I head over to Cognito here, and I'm in Cognito, you can see that I can create a user pool and I can create an identity pool. If I go to create a user pool, you can see that I can create a user pool, which is just a directory where I can have my user information stored. But I can also extend that to create federation, which allows me to add external identity providers like Facebook, like Google, like Amazon, and I can integrate it with that. So hopefully that makes sense to you. So let's move on very quickly in the interest of time. So user pools, what are some of the security features or security functionalities that user pools can provide for a serverless architecture? Number one, sign up and sign in, right? Users that are accessing our applications as serverless applications can sign up to access the application. They can also sign in with credentials that they've created. It has a built-in customizable login UI, so users can customize the UI that they can use when they are accessing our applications. We can control who can access our APIs if we're using Cognito. So one of the ways that we can do that is we can create a group in Cognito. We can add our users into that group in Cognito, and then we can define different roles for different groups of users. So I can say this group will have this role in my application. Group A is going to have the role of reader. Group B is going to have the role of contributor in my application. So Cognito allows us to be able to do that. It can also offer capabilities like compromised credential check. And this is where we begin to see like some advanced capabilities of Cognito right here, compromised credential check. What does that mean by compromised credential check very quickly? What that's talking about is, so some of you may have seen websites like Have I Been Pwned? You know, Have I Been Pwned.com. So this is a website that you can go to and you can check your email address to see as your email showed up in a previous data breach. So maybe there's a popular internet website that had a data breach. Attackers were able to dump all the credentials from their database. Is your credential one of the credentials that was dumped, right? So, but that is essentially what Cognito is doing behind the scene here. Cognito will be able to check previous data breaches and see if your identity has showed up in one of those data breaches. And if it has showed up, it won't allow you to reuse that credentials when you're signing up in Cognito. We can do phone and email verification for MFA when using Cognito. It also has support for something called adaptive authentication. For those that are familiar with the Microsoft world, this is similar to what Microsoft calls conditional access, right? And we're going to talk about adaptive authentication more in the next slide. So this is similar to conditional access in the Microsoft world. So speaking about identity authentication, so this is where Cognito uses machine learning capabilities to determine the risks of users and also the risks of signing into Cognito. So Cognito will be looking at every sign-in attempt. And when it's looking at the sign-in attempt, it's going to be looking for different signals. So for example, is the device that is being used to sign in, is this a new device profile? So maybe the user typically uses a Windows 10 PC with Chrome, or maybe an Android mobile phone with the Chrome browser. All of a sudden, they're authenticating using a Mac or a Linux machine with Firefox. That's a different profile for this user. Cognito can flag that and say, this seems a bit suspicious for this user, right? So you're looking at things like the device that the user is logging in from, things like the location. The user typically logs in from Lagos, Nigeria, 9 a.m. every day. But now the user is all of a sudden logging in from Germany at 2 a.m. in the morning. That's not usual. What is going on there, right? So it's going to be looking at things like the network and the IP address that the sign-in is coming in from. The user typically logs in from this IP address, but now they're logging in from this strange IP address that we've never seen before, right? It can flag that up and say this is risky. Right? So it's going to be looking at all these signals, and then it can even notify the users and say, hey, user, there seems to be suspicious login that's coming from with your username and password. Is this you, or is this something that you don't recognize? And then it can use that and feed that back into the machine learning model to learn how to detect even better. Right? And what you can see here is we can also configure our responses to the different detection that Cognito does with adaptive authentication. So for example, if Cognito detects something that it considers to be low risk, we can decide, do we want to allow that sign-in to proceed? Do we want to implement optional MFA? Do we want to require the user to do MFA? Or do we want to block that sign-in attempt? So we can do that for low risk, medium risk, and high risk. So one of the things to note if you're planning to do the exam is the difference between optional MFA and MFA required. If you've specified optional MFA, if you have a user that is yet to enroll their MFA, the user will still be able to authenticate, right? Because MFA is optional. So even if they've not enrolled MFA, they will still be able to authenticate. But if you specify that MFA is required, if the user has not been enrolled for MFA, they will not be able to sign in. So just keep that in mind if you're planning to do the exam. These are the sorts of details that you need to know if you're going to be planning to do the exam. So let's move on very quickly because of time. We have very limited time before we get to the prize. Okay, so here's an example of a user sign-in view in Cognito. So you can see a user has authenticated to Cognito. And what we have here is we have information about the sign-in information. So the context, which location is the sign-in coming in from, which device is the sign-in coming in from, which IP address, was any risk detected in that sign-in attempt? And then what is the, so that's the risk level that was detected, was any risk detected, and then was the decision that was made based on the risk that was detected. So this is adaptive authentication in place in Cognito. So we said Cognito has two parts to it. There is user pools and the other part is identity pools. So identity pools in Cognito, that is what we can use to grant our users access to other AWS services. In other words, once a user, so you can see user pools right here. So we have user pools, right? So that is again our user directory. Once a user is authenticated, maybe it's not just about authenticating to our application. Maybe we also want the user to be able to access certain AWS services. That is where identity pools comes in Cognito. So user sign in to the identity pool. Again, that could be backed by user pool. That could be backed by any of the other federated identity providers. They receive a token. And then when they receive the token is going to be converted to an AWS temporary credentials by making a call to AWS STS, and then the token can be used to access AWS services. So here is an example authentication flow leveraging Cognito identity pool. So when we're talking about authentication flow in Cognito identity pool, there are two main flows that we can implement, especially when we're talking about public provider. We can implement a basic authentication flow, or we can implement what is called an enhanced authentication flow. For majority of situations, you probably want to implement the enhanced authentication flow and not the basic one. Why? Why do we want to implement the enhanced one and not the basic one? It's simple. The enhanced option has advanced capabilities that the basic one does not have. So for example, the number of network calls that's required to authenticate using the enhanced flow is fewer than the number of network calls that you need to make if you're implementing the basic flow, right? So that basic is less efficient. Also, if we're implementing this in our application with the SDK, if we're implementing the enhanced flow, we only need two pieces of information that we need to embed within our application. If we're implementing the enhanced flow in our application, we only need to embed information about the identity pool ID, and we need to implement, add information about the region where the Cognito identity pool was created. With basic, you may need to be embedding things like role information in your code, which is not the most ideal, right? So just keep that in mind. So again, this is an example authentication flow in using Amazon Cognito identity pool. So in this case, the process starts with the user logging in. The user logging into the web identity provider. So, and again, that could be user pools, that could be federated identity providers, and the user gets an access token back. So that is number 2. The user gets an access token back. And the access token can then be used to make requests to the Cognito identity pool. In this case, the get ID API call is made to Cognito, and that get ID API call is used to retrieve the identity information for the user that just authenticated. So what's the identity information? Give me the profile information of that user. Cognito at every stage is going to validate the access token that was granted in step 2. So it's going to validate the access token. Is the token valid? Has it expired? Is the token truly issued by the identity provider? It's going to validate that. If the token is successfully validated, then it can return that user profile information back to the application that's making the call, right? And then you can go ahead and you can make other calls. So for example, it's making a call to get the credentials for the identity, or to get information about credentials for the identity. At every stage, it's always going to validate the access token that was issued in step 2. And in this case, if that validation was successful, it can make a call to AWS STS to say, can I get the temporary credential that this user can use to go make a call to AWS services, and it can get that information. Okay, I've been talking for a while. I'm not sure if there's any question, but I'll carry on very quickly in the interest of time. So, any questions at all? Blessing, because I'm not able to see the chat window.
No, nothing yet. I think quite well everyone is following on with the class, or maybe they're shy. They're waiting to eat their Christmas chicken.
Oh, and the questions for today, a lot of the questions today are going to be on Amazon Cognito. So we'll be able to tell, where people are with their Amazon Cognito knowledge in a few minutes.
Yes. And Amazon Cognito is quite tricky. So I really hope we're really getting the hang of it. So it's a great topic to work on.
Yes, it is. It's a very interesting one, right? It's a very, very interesting one because, again, like to your point, it can be a bit tricky for some people because it's not like one of the popular services that's regularly implemented. But if you're planning to do the certification exam, expect to get a few questions around Amazon Cognito.
Yes, so let's exactly.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So let's move on to the next service in terms of securing, serverless architecture on AWS. So Cognito is about securing the authentication and access. Now let's go talk about API Gateway. So what is API Gateway? API Gateway is a service that we can use to create, we can use to publish, we can use to maintain, we can use to monitor, and we can use to secure API. So there's a lot of things that we can use it for. Essentially, this is about publishing and managing APIs at scale. So that is what this is for. So essentially, this service can act as a front door for backend APIs. So we could have backend APIs hosted on EC2. We could have backend APIs hosted on as Lambda functions, right? Or they could be hosted even on external services that are not even in AWS, right? So, but this is the front door for you to access these backend APIs. It has capabilities where it can protect against spikes with throttling. So it has throttling capabilities. We have capabilities to be able to configure policies to protect our API. So maybe we don't want a user to be able to make more than 3,000 requests in a minute. We can put in a policy to say we don't want a request to be more than 3,000 calls per minute, right? And we can do that on a per API basis. So for every API that we create and publish in Amazon API Gateway, we can have different policies for the different APIs. It has integration with AWS WAF, which means we can do protection against popular, web application attacks like SQL injection, cross-site scripting, file injection. We can do protection against those types of attacks using AWS WAF integrated within the Amazon API Gateway. It has capabilities for authorization and authentication and authorization with access control. We'll look at some of those in a few minutes, but it can also integrate with Cognito. right? So people authenticate with Cognito, and then based on the authentication results, they can be granted access to an API in Amazon API Gateway. It has integration with CloudWatch for monitoring. So as people are making the calls to CloudWatch, all this information will be collected and we can review them in CloudWatch. So for example, what's the latency for the API call that just came in? How many times was the API called? Which method was called? Those type of information will be kept in CloudWatch. So here is an example, a sample architecture that uses the API gateway. So here's an example flow, right? And this flow is, or this architecture is what you refer to as an edge optimized architecture. It's referred to as an edge optimized architecture because it's leveraging CloudFront to optimize how it serves the API. So it's using CloudFront. So the API gateway is not just exposed directly, it's leveraging CloudFront. So in this case, a request comes in from the client. So maybe the client is using an application on their mobile phone, on the website, or maybe a backend service in an application. So the request comes in through Amazon CloudFront's location. So the request will be accepted from CloudFront and then will be routed to Amazon API Gateway in the customer's region. And this is where the magic begins to happen. So this is where Gateway begin to assess, all the policies that we've put in place. So, and it's going to check its cache location. Do I have this information that you are requesting in the cache? If the information exists in the cache, it's going to serve that back directly to the client if it has the information in the cache. If it doesn't have the information in the cache, it calls the backend service. So again, that could be hosted on Amazon EC2, that could be hosted on Lambda, calls the backend service, gets the result back, maybe caches the result, stores the information or the logs in Amazon CloudWatch, and returns the request back to the client. So here's a sample architecture of just what Amazon API Gateway looks like. So let's talk about access control for API endpoints. So in order for us to be able to control access for who can invoke APIs that we've published in API Gateway, we want to be able to control that access. And we can control that access using something called resource policies that some of you may know about, right? So last week in the IAM session, we talked about IAM policies and we talked about resource policies. We said IAM policies are attached to a user, right? You attach a policy to a user. Resource policies are attached to a resource. So in this case, we have our API gateway, and then we can have a resource policy, and then we can attach that policy to our API gateway. And that policy defines who has permission to call which APIs in that gateway, is what that's defining. So maybe we're specifying user in our AWS account. Maybe we are specifying users in another AWS account, right? And I'll show you an example policy on the next slide of a user of configuring a resource policy to allow a user in another AWS account to call an API in API Gateway. So maybe we're even publishing things in a private way. So maybe we want the API calls to only come from our private networks, from our VPCs. So we can integrate interface endpoints to lock that down a bit more. So with VPC endpoint. So let's have a look at an example resource policy. So here's an example resource policy. So what this policy is doing is that it's granting the access or the permission to invoke an API. So that's the action that this policy is granting access to. You can see that the effect is allowed. So it's allowing the permission to invoke an API. Which API is it granting the permission to invoke? It's granting permission to invoke this API. And this is a very interesting one because what you're seeing here is one of the things that makes API Gateway very flexible. For every API that we publish in API Gateway, there is a unique Amazon resource name, a unique ARN that we can reference. So in this case, it's referencing a particular method, the get method of that API right there. And saying you can invoke that. But who is it granting the permission to? You can see that in this case, it's granting the permission to a user called Alice in that AWS account. So we can put the AWS account ID there. And in this case, it's also granting permission to the root user in that AWS account. So, and then we can attach this policy to our API gateway resource to grant permission for who can invoke the API. Speaking about security features, here are the security features of Amazon API Gateway. So number one, it has support for HTTPS, which means we can enforce encryption in transit. We can say you can only make API calls using HTTPS. HTTP is not allowed. As I mentioned earlier, it has Amazon resource name for every single API that we publish. And that means that we can define fine-grained policy. We can define very granular policy in terms of who has access to what within our environment. So we can define those policies right there. Okay, so let's see what else can we do from a security perspective in terms of this. So it has support for transaction rate limitation. So this is where we can use this to protect against things like DDoS attack, where we can, again, maybe limit the rates to maybe 5,000 calls per minute. And we can do that for every individual API that we're publishing. And of course, that's support for caching. So this is about efficiency, right? So requests that it's serving, it caches the request first before serving that back to the client that made the request. So let me look at the time very quickly. So we have a few more minutes. So I need to get to the final part. And then we'll get to the quiz. So let's talk about the final part, which is securing AWS Lambda functions, right? So we've talked about the authentication with Cognito. We've talked about the access with API Gateway. Now let's talk about securing AWS Lambda functions itself. So let's get started with this. Looking at, okay, here we go. I just need my pen. So AWS Lambda, what is it? This is a service that we can use to run code without provisioning or managing servers. I don't want to manage servers. I just want to run code. We have AWS Lambda that we can use for that. So it has different built-in capabilities like the ability to securely access other AWS services. So it can do that. We can associate an IAM role with our Lambda. And then any function that we're running in Lambda can leverage the IAM role to securely access an AWS services. Maybe this Lambda function needs to access an S3 bucket. Maybe it needs to access a DynamoDB table. We can do that. Again, it can implement IAM role to provide permissions. We can actually implement this privately. By default, Lambda doesn't exist in a private VPC, right? In our VPC. Right? It exists in a VPC that's managed by AWS. So we can actually implement this privately so that we can begin to leverage capabilities like security group and network access control lists to secure things from the network level. Lambda also has support for environment variables. Environment variables allows us to pass application configuration information to our code without embedding that information directly in the code. So the configuration is decoupled from the code itself, right? So, and then at runtime, it can pass that information to the function code. But that's not where it ends, because what Lambda also has is the capability to encrypt those application configuration information using AWS KMS. So we can encrypt them so that only the function access to the key in KMS that it can use to decrypt this information. So that is very important, because otherwise we don't want to be exposing this information in plain text. So when we talk about a function, this is a typical Lambda function flow. So we have our code that's hosted on the on AWS Lambda. We have the event source, which is what is going to initiate the execution of the code. And then our function code can also call out to other services in AWS, again, leveraging things like AWS IAM roles. So when we are talking about this, it's important to know like the different methods that a function can be invoked and the different models that are supported. So for example, in terms of the event sources that Lambda supports, It supports event sources like, timer. So we can say run this code at certain times of the day. It supports event sources like S3 bucket. If a new bucket arrives in an S3 bucket, run this code, maybe to process the objects that was just added to the bucket, maybe to event bridge. So it has different event sources, but those event sources behave differently. Some of them use a push mode. Some of them use a pull mode. So a push mode is where if the event happens, that event will be used to trigger the code immediately. So Lambda doesn't have to pull that for that event. So that's what is called a push model. So S3 can operate in that model. When a new object arrives, it pushes that event to Lambda to trigger the code. Some event sources only support the pull mode, in which case a Lambda has to pull for that event source to see if that event has happened, and then to know whether it's going to execute the code. So just keep that in mind. There's also option for us to do a direct invocation. So that is where we expose a Lambda over API gateway. So we expose a Lambda over API gateway in this case. And when we expose a Lambda over API gateway, then clients can call that API directly, and that's going to invoke a function code. So that's called a direct invocation. So similar to what we talked about with API gateway, we can also control permission for who can invoke our function using resource-based policies. So remember, resource-based policies are policies associated with a resource. So in this case, we can use to define who can invoke our functions. And we have the action that we can specify is the Lambda invoke function action. And then we can specify the principles that can invoke that action. And we can define multiple statements in a single policy. So let me show you an example of what a resource-based policy for invoking a function, what that looks like. So here's an example of that very quickly. So again, remember, as I'm about to conclude, but if you have any questions, put your questions in the chat window. Do not forget that. Okay, so here's an example of a policy. So in this policy, it's giving permission to an API gateway to invoke a Lambda function. So that is what this is doing. So what we have here is we have the service that we're granting the permission to the principal. So that can be a user, but in this case, we're granting the permission to API gateway. So we're saying API gateway is allowed to invoke this function. And then we define the function resource, the ARN of our function, and then we can specify other conditions like maybe the gateway methods that API gateway is allowed to use when it's invoking the function. So maybe a get, a post, a purge, a delete, HTTP method. So here's an example of that. Again, that can be a user, and that can be a role also. It can be a user in the same account. It can be a user in another AWS account. So we said apart from permission to who can invoke our function, we can also configure permission for what the function can do within our AWS environment. And to do that, we can use a runtime role. We associate the role with our function. And then there are two types of policy involved here. Number one, we have to define a trust policy for our IAM role. The trust policy defines the AWS Lambda function that has the permission to use that role. So we need to define that. It's advisable to be specific when we are defining the trust policy. In other words, we can define a trust policy that says every AWS Lambda function can use this role, right? That's too broad. What we want to do is we want to define the specific ARN of our Lambda function when we're defining the trust policy. And then the other side of that is the actual access that the policy will grant to our function. Again, maybe that could be permission to an S3 bucket. That could be permission to a DynamoDB table. And then talking about monitoring and logging. So talking about monitoring and logging. So AWS Lambda integrates with Amazon CloudWatch. And what that means is that all the information, all the calls, all the requests that are happening are going to be logged to Amazon CloudWatch. So we can get metrics information and we can get logs information. So the table that we have here point out some of the key metrics that we can check for in Amazon CloudWatch for an AWS function. So for example, we can check the invocation metrics in CloudWatch for a function. So what's the number of times that this function has been invoked? How many errors has occurred in the function? What's the duration that it took for the function codes to run and then to stop running, right? So have there been attempts to exceed the limit, right? So have there been any throttling that's going on? So we can get all those information in Amazon CloudWatch metrics. And then AWS Lambda also integrates with CloudWatch logs. So it's going to push all the log information. So maybe in our code, what we're doing is we're logging certain information in our code. So maybe input error, output error, we're writing that out in our code. AWS Lambda will automatically push those into CloudWatch, and then we can review them. Okay, so ladies and gentlemen, that brings us to the end of this today. So any question at all, Blessing? Yeah.
Oh, nothing at all yet. Thank you very much, David, for this very insightful session. One thing that was actually very tricky for me before I got the hang of it was actually this Cognito user pool, federation. You just be wondering, you be seeing questions and you just be getting all mixed up. Was this for? Was that for? And taking time to kind of to explain it for us to understand is really very amazing. Like, you're magical. Thank you for this wonderful session. And I'm very certain that those that are still on with us really appreciate what you're doing. And those that would watch this later would really appreciate it. So kudos to that. Thank you very much for that. And
thanks very much, Blessing.
So any questions, please do drop. Oh, thank you, Hichem from Tunisia. Thank you for joining us. Any questions? If there's none, then we'll be praying for our quiz. And of course, we want someone to get away with win the quiz. And
yeah, so we have the quiz for today. So today's prize, again, it's a $50 Amazon credit. So
50,000.
Oh no, not 50,000. It's just 50.
You know what someone can do with that? 50,000. Whoa. I think I'm going to today's one is 50,000.
So today is $50. Let's be clear, it's $50, not 50,000. I don't think that AWS actually has created like a voucher for 50,000 yet. So it's $50. So what I've done is I've put the link in the chat window to the question, to the quiz. Or what people can do is they can also go to www.kahoot.it, so not .com.it, and put in the PIN number of 9942460. 9942460.
Yes, the PIN and the link is in the comment section, so you can just click it directly and go. Or just like you said, you go to the site and put in the PIN and join us.
Yeah. And also, just to mention to everyone, there are rules of the game. And many of you already know the rules. So I can see Ichem is joining again. But Ichem already won yesterday a security voucher. So Ichem, you cannot win 2 times in this series. So that's one of our rules. You can only win once.
Doesn't mean you should drop. If you are the topmost, so just give the second person. Please stay on and play the game. Don't drop out. Don't feel discouraged. Still enjoy the game. It's all about
absolutely
learning.
Fine. Yeah, it was actually very funny. It was like, so yesterday, Blessing. So we had someone called GM. So whenever I begin to see names like YB, I'm beginning to suspect that's the previous winner. So we had a name yesterday called GM that joined yesterday. And then GM won the quiz, right? So I was like, oh, GM, you need to send us your information so I can send you your voucher. And GM turns out to be Bemi, who won our voucher before. Bemi, Bemi that she already got the voucher and she passed the certification. So
yes.
So we had to allocate the gift to Ichem this time because Bemi already won before. So anytime I see like GM, YB, MG, I'm like, okay, maybe that's a previous winner that doesn't want us to know their name easily. anyways, let's get started for today's quiz. So let's see the first question for today. So the questions today are a bit tougher, I just warn you. A lot of them are around Cognito, so but we'll see. You are developing an app to utilize third-party social IDPs. What information is not required to configure the IDP? So I told you we're going to be testing you in very detailed. And by the way, these are similar type of questions that you get if you're planning to, do the
Yes,
certification
they
exam.
can just be very quite tricky. I'm not a big fan of Cognito, but when you get a hang of it, like you'll be amazed
Yes, it
that
is.
that is actually very easy.
Yep. Yeah, it is actually like so personally for me, I'll say to people like if you know Azure AD, if you know Okta, you know Cognito already. So if somebody knows Azure AD, I just explain Cognito to them using Azure AD language. If they know Okta, I just explain Azure AD to them using Okta language. So they are all these are all competing services that provide the same capabilities. So let's see. So, no one got this correctly. Interesting. So we have three information here. So essentially what this is saying is you want to integrate your application with a third-party identity provider incognito. Which information do you need? Which information do you not need? The token is not something that you provide in our application. The token is something that Cognito returns after authenticating the user. So by area of elimination, we can eliminate the token. So OIDC is OpenID Connect token. So you need to provide the application client ID. You need to provide the application secrets, and you need to provide the list of scopes that it has access to. Actually, let me see if I've got like, so for example, if I go ahead and I create my Cognito tool, I won't create it, but I just want to show you like what that looks like. I integrate that with an identity provider. Let's say I specify you can sign in with your username and your email, and I specify username is case sensitive, and I specify that I want to integrate this with Facebook or identity provider with Google. When I get to the section where I configure my application, if I go to next, so I need to specify MFA Authenticator app. If I go to next, we're going to get to a place where I need to specify the attribute that that's required. So if I specify email attribute and say that is required, so that is required already, so that is fine. So email required attribute. So let's go to next. So, and this is how the email will be sent. So let me say I'm going to send the email directly from Cognito for things like that. So let's go to next. So you can see the information that we have to specify. We specify our application ID, we specify our application secret, and we specify the scope, not the token. So that's what that's talking about. So no one got that correctly. So, but anyways, you remember now. Let's check out the next question. So the leaderboard stays the same. So next question. You wish to provide some of the objects in a S3 bucket to authenticated users. How should you implement? So this is again a Cognito question. And let's see, one person got that correctly. Hey, I feel your pain. I understand, Cognito, which is why we're talking about it. So just a review of this very quickly.
I think
So
everybody's really thinking of Christmas chicken. That's why.
maybe that's
Because
why.
this was not what we had yesterday.
Yeah,
So
that is true. But also, I did, to be honest, I did because we have a pool of questions. I did up the game a little bit, right? To sort of like challenge us a little bit. So by in terms of the questions. So with this one, it's actually probing our knowledge of Cognito. So we said Cognito is made up of two parts. We have user pool and identity pool. User pool is just a user directory. An identity pool is what we use if we want to provide access to AWS services. So user pool goes out the window for that question, right? So user pool is gone. So I'm glad that no one picked that. So, but in this case, he said we want to provide access to some of the objects in an S3 bucket. So turning on public access on the bucket level is not going to help us. So that's eliminated. Configuring IAM user account with restricted policies, that's eliminated because the question says we want to provide access to unauthenticated users. So in this case, Cognito Identity Pool does allows us to provide access to unauthenticated user to only specific objects in an S3 bucket. So that's one of the use cases that we have for that. So let's see what the scoreboard looks like. So we have Dini. So well done, Dini. So we have 3 more questions.
Godini.
You need to implement a captcha as part of an app user sign-in process. What is the most efficient way to implement? This is a Cognito question also. And let's see, we got 3 people that got that correctly. So in this particular case, so we can use Cognito to implement captcha as part of our authentication flow. However, if we want to use a flow that includes something like captcha, we'll need to implement an off challenge Lambda trigger. There's a typo there. So that's the answer to that. So again, maybe there will be a time when I can show a demo of this maybe in the future. So let's see what the scoreboard looks like. So we've got Abdul Latif, Yemi, and Dini, the top 3. So we've got 2 more questions to go. Let's see. Some app users should be allowed read access, others contributor access. You're using Cognito. What should you do? So there's a good reason why I've done this. And I'll tell you the reason why blessing at the end. The reason why I've sort of like done this. So because there is a challenge that I have for people, we're gonna go away for a holiday. Someone is gonna win the prize. We're gonna go away for our holidays, but I have a challenge for people. Just one of the reasons why I have these probing questions.
Oh, that makes sense. At least you still keep people refreshed and they remember that they have studies and AWS during the holiday. But I'm going to shut down. I'm not going to remember at all.
True. And lots of people got that correctly. So well done. The answer is to create different groups in Cognito, add the user to the groups, and then you can give those groups different roles in your application. So that's the answer. So let's see what the scoreboard looks like. So Scoreboard remains the same. Abdulatif, Yemi, and Dini. And the final question for today. Final question to determine the winner. You need to implement a custom module in API gateway for authentication authorization calls. What should you do? This one will probably be by elimination. It's probably the easiest way to get to the answer for this one, is to eliminate what's not the correct answer. And the answer to that is A, use a Lambda authorizer. So by eliminating, caching doesn't help us for custom module for authentication authorization. Cost doesn't help us, right? That's for something completely different. If you're having multiple calls or chained calls. And implementing a custom API endpoint doesn't help us. The answer to that is to use a Lambda authorizer. So Lambda authorizer in API gateway. Formerly, so the former name would have been much more easier to answer, right? Because it used to be called custom authorizer. So it's a way to implement custom authentication modules in API gateway. So we can use a Lambda authorizer, what was previously called custom authorizer, to do that. So let's see what the scoreboard and let's see what our winner is for today. So on the podium, Abdul Latif, number 3. So well done. Dini, number 2. Number 1.
Winner.
Yeah, whoa! Yemi took that on the last question, you know.
Yes.
And we have Richard and Gabriel.
How tables can turn in a second.
Yeah.
So don't give up. You never say never. Don't be.
Awesome. That's awesome. So what will happen? So Yemi, so I'll put an email address in the chat window. So you drop us an email. So each time we got your email yesterday. So thanks very much for sending that. So we got your email yesterday. And again, we're working with AWS and they will send that to you. Promise, they definitely will. But Yemi, what you need to do is you need to send us an email. I have the email address here. I just need to bring it up. Where is it hiding? Where is the email address from yesterday? Anyways, it's AWS Sec West Africa at outlook.com. So send us your email address. So Yemi, your full name and your email address. Send this to that, and we're gonna get that to you. So Tayo said, "Baby, one handicap." Yeah, yesterday, baby was GM yesterday, and then she won again. Before we uncovered that GM meant Baby Mati. So
please include your HM. Please also send us a shout out on LinkedIn, AWS Cloud Security User Group with your, so that we can get your profile name. Also,
yeah, that would
Yemi,
be
keep
awesome.
the same, so that
Yeah,
we
that'd be
can
awesome.
make a post about this. Yes.
Yeah. And thanks very much for handling that. So for those that may not know, Blessing handles all the magic that's been going on with social media, and she's been awesome at doing amazing work. So thanks very much for that, Blessing. So Blessing, I'll hand back over to you in case there's anything else that you want to share with the audience before we close for today. But that's it from my end for today. So hopefully people learned a thing or two. So I did mention I did have a challenge for you. So my challenge for you is whenever you get the chance to the audience, the reason why I brought out the much more probing questions for Cognito is to show that in cases where you're not too familiar with certain services, before you do the exam, I would recommend do a hands-on tutorial on that service, because the only way to be able to answer some of the questions I asked today is if you've done at least a hands-on tutorial on it. So if you've implemented it actually. So go to the AWS documentation on Cognito, go to the tutorial section and implement do the lab to implement Cognito. So if you have access to a Cloud Guru or Cloud Academy, they both have labs on Cognito also. So just implement it in practice. That way, you're not familiar with the service, but that way, if you implemented it in practice, you'll be able to answer some of these probing questions that may come up in the exam. Okay, so that's it from me. Thanks very much. So I'll hand back over to Blessing.
Thank you very much, Davey. That was very, very interesting. I learned a whole lot, and I'm very certain those that stayed with us learned a whole lot. Yes, Merry Christmas, Happy Christmas, in whatever way you say it. So I'm all for the vibes for this period. So as we're preparing for our exams, you can see how tasking or challenging it was, how tricky rather the questions were. So by the time you rehearse or you practice a question and you fail, just do what David said. Try to go and try to do a hands-on. It will be, you remember it better. It will become clearer by the time you do hands-on. Or if you're not opportune, maybe you're lacking credit to do hands-on, you can try to use various practice questions or various tutorial from different people, and I'm very certain you'll be able to get it. But the sure bet is always hands-on. Yes, we'll be having our next class from next year. We're resuming. We are still with you. So if you have any questions for us, you can reach us on all our social media platforms, LinkedIn, Twitter, but most especially LinkedIn. Then we'll always get back to you with any questions you have. You can always come back to watch any of the videos, and please do remember to subscribe to our channel. We have a whole lot in stock for next year. Thank you for coming. Do have a Merry Christmas and a prosperous New Year for all of us at the AWS Security User Group West Africa. Thank you, David. Thank you, everyone, for coming. Thank you, Yemi. Thank you, Hichem. Thank you to the amazing people that joined us. Do have a good night rest. Yes, do join us on Meetup. Just go to Meetup and search. You can save the links, and we'll also share it on our LinkedIn and Twitter hand page. Do well to follow us on the various platforms to be updated with any of our activities that we have. See you next year. But we still
Bye,
have
everyone.
you.